Hello, this is Law and Terrorism, the podcast series. I'm your professor, Glenn Torres-Spelliscy. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining me for this week's edition of 5 Key Questions. The topic this week relates to the concepts of responsibility and accountability for international wrongs. In this lecture, we will focus on the concepts of state responsibility. So let's get started. When we think about the idea of responsibility, we must begin by understanding the idea of agency at the international level. Who or what can be held responsible for a wrong under international law? The answer to that question lies in the concept of an international legal person. An international legal person is a person or an entity, indeed the term usually refers to states as compared to natural persons, that is imbued with certain rights and obligations under international law. When speaking about international responsibility for terrorist acts, we focus our attention on two types of international legal persons. The first and perhaps most obvious are the individuals. Most terrorism charges will be linked back to one individual or a group of individuals, who will be brought to justice in a domestic criminal law system. There is, however, another potential international legal person who may be deemed responsible for terrorist activities: a state. Of course, a state is responsible if it was directly involved in the operational planning or execution of the attack. But what if a state was not involved in the planning or execution of the attack? What if the only connection is that a non-state actor is operating from their territory? Can the state still be held responsible? That question will be at the heart of our inquiry in this lecture. If a state can be held responsible for terrorist attacks under international law, the first question we must answer is, what is a state? A state is defined by the Inter-American Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, the Montevideo Convention, as an entity that has the following characteristics: a defined territory, a permanent population, a sovereign government, meaning the government has sovereignty and general authority over its territory, and the capacity to engage in formal relations with other such entities. So let's talk about those in a little more detail. First, the requirement that a state possesses a defined territory imposes no limitation as to its overall size. There is no minimum size of territory required for statehood. Second, the defined territory doesn't have to be perfectly defined. Indeed, this was one of the key issues that arose when Israel was applying for membership in the United Nations. If you recall, when Israel was first established, its borders were not fixed, and more importantly, were not accepted by its neighbors. However, in supporting its admittance to the UN, the U.S. representative argued that the concept of territory does not necessarily include precise delimitation of the boundaries of that territory. Now, even if a state has a defined territory, in order to be a state, there needs to be a permanent population. And permanent means that the population is not transient, but exists permanently in the territory. For example, Antarctica doesn't have a permanent population and isn't considered a state. The third requirement of statehood is that states have to have a government that has sovereign control, meaning effective control over the population. And finally, the state must have the capacity under its own laws to engage in foreign relations with other states. For example, although U.S. states would fit the other three criteria of international personality, they do not have authority under the U.S. Constitution to conduct foreign relations, and as such do not meet the criteria for international statehood. This is one of the most important international legal theories, because it seeks to bridge the gap between statehood and individual decision-making. The state is an imaginary entity. It has no corporeal existence. Rather, individuals who purportedly represent the state make and implement decisions. The theory of attribution deals with when those individual decisions can be attributed to the state. This is a key concept because a state can only be held responsible for the acts that can be legally attributed to it. So what could be considered a state act? Well, acts of the government are obviously attributable. But with respect to terrorism, there are a few more acts that might be attributable to the state. First, the conduct of non-state actors directed or controlled by the state. For example, if a non-state group is directed or controlled by the state, it will be responsible. Second, conduct carried out by persons exercising elements of government authority, even if they don't have it. For instance, after the Iranian Revolution, many sought to flee the country with their possessions. Border agents, acting outside of their authority, seized many of the goods. The ICJ held that Iran was responsible because agents were performing a governmental function, i.e. customs control. Third, conduct that the state subsequently ratifies and adopts. For example, the seizure of the U.S. Embassy by Iranian students in 1979 was considered by the ICJ as an act of state, because it was encouraged and supported by the Ayatollah after the fact. Consequently, the court held that the Iranian state had adopted the behavior as its own and would be held responsible. And finally, the conduct of an insurrection movement that eventually becomes the government can be held attributable. This is to prevent insurrection movements from committing atrocities on their rise to power by providing a mechanism to hold them accountable once they are in power. The Taliban's recent takeover of Afghanistan is an interesting illustration of the idea. Of course, if they fail their insurrection, we can assume they'll be held to account under the domestic laws of the state that they were rebelling against. In the 1980s, the United States provided significant logistical and military support to a group of rebel fighters in the communist country of Nicaragua. These rebel fighters would later be accused of human rights atrocities, and the government of Nicaragua brought a case before the International Court of Justice, seeking to hold the United States liable for the atrocities. The question at issue was, when can a state be held responsible for the activities of a non-state actor? Obviously, this question would be thrust to the fore again following the 9/11 attacks, as the United States sought to hold the government of Afghanistan responsible. In the case brought by Nicaragua, the ICJ announced a principle of effective control. The court held that a state could only be held responsible for the acts of a non-state actor if that state had effective control over that actor. Now, effective control requires more than a significant connection between the parties. It requires that the state party have operational control and influence over the particular acts at issue. The court found that the provision of money and arms to rebels in Nicaragua was not enough to establish that the United States had effective control over the rebels, and thus the U.S. could not be held legally responsible for their actions. The idea that a state that lacked effective control over a non-state actor could still be held liable came into vogue in the post-9/11 era. The U.S. wanted to find a way to hold the Taliban responsible for allegedly harboring the leadership of al-Qaeda. Under the prevailing legal standard, however, effective control, the government of Afghanistan was unlikely to be held responsible. We'll talk about that shortly. So the U.S. started to push a new understanding. The U.S. argued that responsibility could extend to a state that harbored terrorist groups, even if it had not been involved in planning and did not have operational control over the group. The U.S. argued that a state had a responsibility to ensure this territory was not used by militant non-state actors to attack other states, and if they failed to stop such attacks, it could be held liable under the new theory. Contrary to the approach in Nicaragua, the U.S. was now arguing that the provision of financial support and services, i.e. harboring and supporting the terrorist group, may now be enough to lead to state responsibility. Let's go back to Afghanistan, where we arguably saw the doctrine of indirect responsibility at play. If we look at the facts on the ground, it's clear that the Taliban harbored the al-Qaeda leadership, in that they gave the group safe haven. Further, there did appear to be a relationship between the leadership of the Taliban and the leadership of al-Qaeda. But is that enough to attribute liability under a theory of overall control? Al-Qaeda had a separate leadership structure, and there is no evidence to suggest that the Taliban knew of, participated in, or approved of the September 11th attacks. Under traditional doctrines, the answer would therefore appear to be that the Taliban should not have been held responsible. But in the post-9/11 world, a different conclusion was reached. Indeed, the international community stood with the United States in its attack on Afghanistan, and there has never been much debate about whether it was an appropriate use of force. Well, that does it for this week's introductory podcast. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week for a new installment of 5 Key Questions.